Have you ever stumbled upon something that felt alive, even after decades of silence? Tonight, here on Whisper Sleep Studio, we open the doors to an old bookshop in Charleston, a place heavy with dust, memories, and echoes of love long forgotten. When Daniel Whitlock inherits his late father's bookstore, he expects ledgers and unpaid bills, but instead, he discovers a wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside, 12 unmailed letters, written during World War II, each one addressed to a woman named Eleanor, from a man known only as Jay. Letters that were never sent, and perhaps were never meant to be found. But once opened, their voices begin to whisper through the walls, and the past, long buried, starts to breathe again. Before we begin this haunting journey through time, take a deep breath. Let the sound of rain calm your mind. And if you love mysterious, emotional stories that echo through history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Whisper Sleep Studio, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Whether it's a quiet city apartment, a countryside room, or somewhere between dreams, I'd love to know. Now, close your eyes if you wish, and let the whispers guide you. This is The Letters from Nowhere, a forbidden love story that refused to die. Have you ever opened a book and found a story that was never meant the inheritance of silence? 1,000 words. The story begins on a rain-softened morning in Charleston, where the air smelled faintly of old paper and salt from the harbor, and the sky hung low like a curtain drawn over a forgotten stage. I, Daniel Whitlock, had just inherited my late father's bookshop, a crumbling little sanctuary tucked between two brick buildings on King Street, its wooden sign faded and crooked from decades of sun. Whitlock's books had been my father's world, and as I stood before its locked door for the first time since his funeral, I felt a strange mix of reluctance and reverence. The key trembled in my hand before turning with a click that echoed softly in the quiet morning. Inside, the shop smelled of dust and leather, the scent of 1,000 unread stories. Rows of shelves stood like weary soldiers, guarding the memories of readers long gone. Dust motes danced in narrow rays of light that filtered through the blinds. My father had left me this shop, though I'd never shared his passion for books. I was a practical man, more concerned with numbers than narratives, and my plan was simple: sell the place, pay off the debts, and close this chapter of my family's story. Yet something in the stillness that morning felt like a whisper asking me not to rush. As I began to explore, I noticed the peculiar organization of the shop. My father had kept meticulous records, his handwriting neat and deliberate, but there were areas of disarray, corners stacked with unopened boxes, piles of receipts tied with twine, and shelves that seemed untouched for decades. It felt less like a bookstore and more like a museum of someone's private obsession. I began sorting through the ledgers at the old counter, brushing aside the layer of dust that coated everything. Beneath a stack of unpaid bills, I found a small brass key no larger than my thumb, tied with a brittle string and labeled only with the word basement. I frowned. The shop had no visible basement door, at least none I'd seen growing up. Curiosity nudged at me like a ghost. For hours, I searched behind shelves and under tables until I found a narrow wooden hatch hidden behind a false wall near the back. It looked untouched for decades. When I unlocked it, the hinges groaned in protest as though disturbed from a long sleep. The air that escaped was cold and heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic, old ink, perhaps. I climbed down the creaking steps with a flashlight in hand, its weak beam cutting through the darkness. The basement was small, lined with crates of books that had likely never been sold. My father had been a collector of obscure histories, and I expected nothing more than forgotten tomes. But in the far corner, resting on a shelf that looked recently disturbed, I noticed a small wooden box wrapped in a yellowed ribbon. Inside were several envelopes, perfectly preserved, their paper soft with age. Each was addressed to someone named Eleanor Hargrove, written in an elegant, looping hand. The return address was simply signed with an initial J. None of the letters had been mailed. My pulse quickened. Why would my father have kept these? And who were Eleanor and Jay? I took one envelope and carefully unfolded the letter within. The ink had faded, but the words still spoke with surprising clarity. My dearest Eleanor, the nights grow colder without you. The war has taken many things, but none so painful as our separation. I carry your last smile with me like a lantern in the dark. It was dated June 1943. A wartime letter, written by a man far from home to a woman he loved, a love story that never reached its destination. The handwriting trembled slightly near the end, as if written by candlelight, in haste. I read through a few more. Each was tender, filled with longing and quiet desperation, but they all ended the same way, with a promise to return and an unfulfilled yearning that lingered between the lines. There were 12 letters in total, none mailed, none answered. I sat there for what felt like hours, surrounded by silence, imagining the man who wrote them, his voice echoing across time. My father had never mentioned any connection to the Hargroves, yet Charleston was a small city. The name was familiar. The Hargrove estate lay on the outskirts, once belonging to one of the oldest families in town. I'd passed it many times as a boy, a grand white mansion with iron gates and ivy crawling up its columns, long abandoned since the war. As I turned another envelope over, something caught my eye. Faintly embossed on the flap was a wax seal, cracked but still visible, the symbol of a rose surrounded by laurel leaves. I'd seen it before, carved into the fence of the old Hargrove property. My hands trembled slightly as realization crept in. This wasn't just a forgotten box of letters. This was a fragment of someone's life, hidden deliberately beneath my father's shop. But why had he hidden it? And from whom? The old floorboards above creaked, breaking my trance. For a moment, I thought I heard a faint sound, like a whisper, or the brushing of fabric against wood. I froze, flashlight shaking slightly in my grip, scanning the basement for movement. Nothing, just silence. Yet that silence seemed alive, listening. I carefully placed the letters back into the box and climbed up, locking the hatch behind me. That night, I stayed in the small apartment above the shop. The rain had returned, tapping against the windows in a steady rhythm that made sleep elusive. I couldn't shake the image of those letters, of Jay writing words meant for someone who never read them. And I couldn't stop thinking about my father, the man who had kept them hidden all these years. As the clock ticked past midnight, a sound broke through the stillness. It was faint, but unmistakable, the slow scrape of something against the floorboards below. I sat up, heart hammering, listening. Then it came again, rhythmic and deliberate, like fingernails tracing wood. The sound was coming from beneath the shop, from the basement. For the first time in my life, the old bookstore no longer felt like home. It felt like it was remembering something it wanted me to uncover. That night, sleep never came easily. The rain whispered against the windows of the apartment above the bookshop, a steady rhythm that blurred the line between the living and the remembered. I kept seeing those letters in my mind, the elegant handwriting, the faded ink, the sorrow frozen in every word. I tried to convince myself they were nothing more than relics of the past, a private story that had somehow slipped into my family's keeping. But deep down, something about them felt alive, unfinished. Around 2 a.m., I finally rose from bed and crept downstairs. The shop was cloaked in darkness, save for the weak amber light that spilled from the street lamp outside. Dust floated like drifting snow in the air. Everything was still, except for a faint rhythmic sound. At first, I thought it was the pipes, but no. It came from the floorboards near the counter. A slow, dragging scratch, soft but deliberate, like a finger tracing wood. My breath caught. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the noise, but the beam only met shelves and shadows. I stood frozen, listening. The scratching stopped. Silence pressed in again, thick and waiting. After a long minute, I forced myself to move. I walked to the hatch and unlocked it, my heart beating hard enough to hear. The air below was cold, the kind of chill that doesn't belong to an ordinary room. I shone the light down the stairs, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. But there was nothing, only the same shelves, the same crates, and the same wooden box sitting in the corner. Yet, the box was open. I was certain I had tied it shut earlier that day. Slowly, I descended and knelt beside it. The letters were spread out across the floor as if someone or something had been reading them. The topmost page was one I hadn't opened before. I hesitated, then picked it up. The handwriting wavered, hurried, as though written under stress. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "they are sending us to Normandy soon. I don't know if I will return, but I can't stop dreaming of you. They say love makes men reckless. Perhaps they're right, because even here, surrounded by the noise of war, all I want is to hear your voice again." My throat tightened as I read on. The letter ended with a single line that chilled me. If you ever receive this, it means I am gone. But know that my heart never left you, not once. I folded it back carefully, hands trembling, and whispered into the dark, "Who were you, Jay?" The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floor, every shift of light felt intentional. I decided I needed answers. I began by searching through my father's old records again. There, in a folder labeled Local Estates, I found something that made me pause. A copy of a property purchase document dated 1967, showing that my father had bought this very building from the Hargrove family. So that was the link. The Hargroves had once owned this land. My father had always been drawn to stories, but this was more than coincidence. I called the Charleston Historical Society and asked about the Hargrove estate. The man on the line spoke with the slow drawl of a Southern archivist, flipping through digital records as I waited. Yes, the Hargrove family, he said finally. Old money. The estate's been vacant since the 1950s. The daughter, Eleanor, I believe, disappeared during the war. Tragic story, really. Rumor was she fell ill. Some say she ran away. No one ever found her. That word, disappeared, stuck in my mind like a thorn. I decided to see the place for myself. The Hargrove estate sat just beyond the marshlands. Its once grand gates rusted and half collapsed. Ivy had devoured the walls, and the windows were blind with grime. As I approached, the wind stirred the tall grass, carrying with it a faint floral scent, like lavender and rain. The front door was locked, but an open side window allowed me to slip inside. Dust lay thick across the marble floors, and faded portraits hung on the walls, their painted eyes watching me with mute judgment. I wandered through rooms filled with silence and decay until I reached the study. There, beneath a cracked portrait of a young woman with dark curls and soft eyes, I found a desk. Its drawers were empty, except one. Inside lay a small photograph, curled with age. It showed a woman who looked exactly like the portrait, Eleanor Hargrove, and a man in uniform beside her, his arm around her waist. His face was handsome but shadowed, his eyes kind yet distant. Scrawled on the back of the photo were the words, J&E 1943, for when we are free. My heart pounded. The pieces were aligning. A forbidden romance during wartime, between a soldier and a woman of status. It wasn't hard to imagine how such a love could have been buried literally and figuratively. But what haunted me most wasn't the tragedy itself. It was the fact that someone, perhaps my father, had known this story and chosen to keep it hidden beneath our shop. As I turned to leave, the air shifted. A faint chill brushed the back of my neck, and for a moment I thought I heard something. Soft, sorrowful, like a woman's sigh. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand. "Is someone here?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The sound faded, replaced by the groan of the house settling. I hurried out, locking the gate behind me, but the memory of that sigh followed me all the way back to town. That night, I couldn't resist reading the rest of the letters. Each revealed more of their hidden love, their meetings in secret, the promises whispered under the stars, the growing danger as her family began to suspect. In one letter, Jay wrote, "They would never let us be, not while their name still carries weight, but love is not bound by walls or titles." Another read, "Eleanor, if they try to take you away, remember the magnolia tree behind your house. That is where I will wait for you." When I finished the final letter, I realized something that sent a shiver through me. The last one was never sealed. It ended mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted. The ink smeared near the edge, and a faint fingerprint marked the corner. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. And in the dark, from somewhere beneath the floorboards came that sound again, the slow, deliberate scratching. Only this time, it wasn't faint. It was right beneath where I stood. The storm that night was heavier than any I remembered, the rain slashing against the windows like a warning. The sound beneath the floorboards had grown louder, more insistent, as if something buried deep below wanted to be heard. I sat in the darkness of Whitlock's books, the dim glow of a lantern casting trembling shadows across the walls, and tried to convince myself it was only the wind or rats in the old beams. But there was rhythm in those sounds, a strange, deliberate rhythm, like someone tracing a message against the floor. Each scrape seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I could feel the air grow colder, sharper, until my breath came out in clouds. The entire shop seemed to breathe with me. Finally, I whispered into the stillness, "What do you want from me?" The sound stopped instantly. Silence fell heavy as ash. Then, after what felt like minutes, a soft creak echoed from below. The hatch. It was open. I took the lantern and slowly approached, the old wooden steps groaning under my feet as I descended into the basement once more. The air there was freezing, thick with the smell of damp earth and old paper. My breath came shallow as I raised the light. The wooden box lay where I had left it, but now the letters were scattered again. Only this time, arranged in a circle as if placed by careful hands. In the center sat a single new object, a small leather-bound journal, its edges warped with moisture and time. I hesitated, knowing that journal hadn't been there before. Its cover bore an embossed emblem, a rose surrounded by laurel leaves, the same symbol as the wax seals on the letters. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. On the first page, written in elegant but weary handwriting, were the words, "The Diary of Eleanor Hargrove, 1944. I turned another page, my heart thudding as her voice unfolded across the paper. March 12, 1944. They found his letters. Father burned them in the fireplace, said I'd bring ruin upon our name. He doesn't know I kept one, hidden beneath the floorboard near the magnolia tree where we used to meet. I can't bear to lose his words. They are all I have left of him." I read on, and the story began to take shape. Eleanor had fallen in love with a soldier, Jay, against her family's will. When she discovered she was pregnant, her parents locked her away inside the estate, claiming illness to protect their reputation. She wrote of nights staring through barred windows, whispering Jay's name into the dark, and of the letter she never sent, the one I had found unfinished beneath my father's store. My lantern flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls as I read the final entry. June 4th, 1944. They are sending him to Normandy. I can feel it in my bones. I've hidden this journal where no one will find it. If Jay returns and I am gone, I hope he knows I never stopped waiting. They will take the child soon. I will not let them. The entry ended abruptly, a line scratched halfway through the page, followed by a dark stain that bled through the paper. Perhaps ink or something else. A cold shiver ran through me. My mind raced as I tried to piece it together. Eleanor, imprisoned, her letters destroyed, her love gone to war, never knowing the truth, and somehow this journal had found its way into my father's basement. I turned to leave, but before I could reach the stairs, the lantern dimmed again, flickering wildly as a rush of cold air swept through the room. The basement door slammed shut above me. Panic rose in my chest. I stumbled backward, clutching the journal to my chest, and that's when I heard it. A voice, soft and trembling, like a breath carried on the wind. "Please, don't let them forget me." The sound was so faint, I thought I'd imagined it. But then, from the far corner of the basement came a flicker of light, a pale, ghostly glow hovering near the floor. It shimmered faintly, shifting into the outline of a woman, her form barely visible through the haze. She was young, dressed in the flowing white of another century, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. Her face was both beautiful and unbearably sad. She lifted her gaze toward me, and though her lips didn't move, her voice filled the air again, echoing directly inside my mind. He never knew. He thought I left him, but I never left. My body felt weightless, frozen in equal parts fear and sorrow. I wanted to speak, to tell her I'd found her letters, her story, but the words refused to come. She reached out a trembling hand, pointing toward the wall behind her, where faint cracks lined the brick. "There," she whispered. "He's waiting." Then, as suddenly as she appeared, the light flickered and vanished, leaving only darkness and the sound of my own breath. I rushed toward the wall she had pointed to, brushing away the dust. The bricks were old and crumbling. Using a rusted iron bar from one of the shelves, I pried a few loose. Behind them was a hollow space, and within it, wrapped in a rotted piece of cloth, was a small wooden box, different from the one that held the letters. Inside lay a single baby's shoe, yellowed with age, and a folded note. My hands shook as I opened it. The handwriting was Eleanor's. "They took her from me, said she would be raised as someone else's child. If anyone finds this, tell her I loved her every day I lived. Tell her my name was Eleanor Hargrove, and I waited for Jay until my heart stopped." I sank to my knees, overwhelmed. The basement no longer felt haunted by malice, but by unbearable grief. These weren't the cries of a vengeful ghost. They were the echoes of a woman who had been silenced, whose story had never been told. As I climbed back to the surface, clutching the journal and the note, I made a silent vow I would uncover the rest of her truth. Back upstairs, the storm outside began to ease. The scratching had stopped completely, replaced by a deep, almost peaceful stillness. The clock on the wall struck 3, and for the first time in days, I felt something shift in the air, a sense of understanding between the living and the lost. As dawn approached, a thin band of light crept through the blinds and fell across the counter, illuminating one of the letters I'd left there. It was the first letter Jay had written. The wax seal shimmered faintly, almost as if reflecting the glow of the rising sun. I picked it up and whispered softly, "I'll find her story, Eleanor, I promise." Outside, the rain stopped completely and the world grew still. The whispers for now had fallen silent, but I knew they were not finished. Something was waiting to be revealed, and I was the only one left to listen. Morning came with a dull gray light, spilling softly through the blinds of the old bookstore. The storm had passed, but its ghost still lingered in the quiet drip of water from the roof and the scent of rain-soaked wood. I hadn't slept. I couldn't. The journal lay open on the counter beside me, the inked confessions of Eleanor Hargrove, whispering through the stillness like a voice I could almost hear. I had spent the night rereading her words, tracing the faded letters with trembling fingers, as if somehow touching them could bring her peace. The story was heartbreakingly clear now. A forbidden love, a family's cruelty, and a secret that had been buried beneath this very floor for decades. But one question still burned like a quiet fire in my mind. What happened to Jay, the soldier who loved her? I began to search through everything my father had left behind. Boxes of receipts, ledgers, even local newspapers from the 1940s. Hours passed before I found a clue, hidden between 2 old atlases. It was a yellowed newspaper clipping dated July 1944. The headline read, "Charleston Soldier Missing in Action, James Whittaker Presumed Lost in Normandy." I froze. The name, James Whittaker, and that initial J. My heart pounded. Could this be him? The article spoke of a young lieutenant beloved by his regiment who had written often to a woman in Charleston before his deployment. The paper had quoted one of his comrades. He carried her photo into battle, said she was his reason to come home. I felt a chill course through me. James Whittaker, J. And suddenly another realization struck me. Whittaker. Whitlock. The names were too close, too familiar. I hurried to check the back of one of Jay's letters. The return address faded but faintly visible. J. Witt. The rest of the ink had smudged away. My hands trembled. My father had once told me the bookstore had been bought from an old soldier's estate. Could my father have known Jay personally? Or perhaps, was there family blood binding these 2 stories together? Driven by a mix of dread and determination, I returned to the Historical Society. The same archivist answered, his tone curious when I asked about James Whittaker. "Ah, yes, Lieutenant Whittaker," he said. Born 1919, served in the 101st, declared missing after D-Day. But interestingly, his body was never recovered. There were rumors he'd survived and returned under another name, though nothing was ever proven. I pressed him further, and after a pause, he added quietly, "One more thing. There's a note in the file, handwritten by someone named Thomas Whitlock. Says he took possession of Whittaker's personal effects after the war. Any relation?" The name hit me like a stone. Thomas Whitlock. My father. My father had been the one to receive Jay's belongings. That explained everything. The letters, the box, the basement. He had hidden them not to conceal a secret, but to protect it. I thanked the archivist and left, my thoughts tangled in a web of generations. If my father had kept this story, then maybe he had known something more. Something I hadn't yet uncovered. When I returned to the bookstore, the air felt different. Not cold, not haunted, just heavy with expectation. I went straight to my father's old office behind the shelves, a cramped room lined with filing cabinets and a single worn desk. There, in the bottom drawer, I found a small envelope marked simply, "For whoever finds the truth." Inside was a letter, written in my father's hand. "Daniel," it began, "if you are reading this, it means the past has found its way back to you, as it once did to me. The letters, the journal, I kept them because they are more than history. They are a confession. James Whitaker was my uncle. Eleanor was the woman he loved. Their child was born in secret and given away to another family. That child grew up never knowing her parents' names. I tried to find her, but all I could learn was that she married and left Charleston decades ago. Her name was Margaret. Margaret. I whispered the name aloud, tasting it like a memory I had never known I carried. I felt something shift in the air, a faint warmth spreading through the room as though someone unseen was listening. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at my father's letter, letting the weight of generations settle on my shoulders. Jay and Eleanor, torn apart by war and family pride, their child, hidden from both, and now me, the accidental inheritor of their silence. That evening, I decided to find Margaret. I searched through online archives, genealogy records, anything that could connect the dots. It took hours of cross-referencing, scrolling through blurred documents and fading census entries until I found it. Margaret H. Lawson, born 1944, Charleston County, adopted same year. The adoption record listed no parents, only a note. Foundling, mother deceased. My heart ached as I stared at those words. Eleanor had died shortly after childbirth, alone, forgotten. I tracked Margaret's trail through time, her schooling, her marriage, her move to Savannah in the 1970s. She was still alive, 80 years old now, living quietly in a small coastal town not far from here. I sat back, staring at her photo from a local newspaper feature, a smiling older woman with kind eyes holding a charity award. Something in her expression, the tilt of her smile, reminded me of the portrait of Eleanor in the Hargrove estate. The resemblance was undeniable. That night, I stood in the bookstore again, the air calm, almost expectant. I took one of Jay's letters, the first one, and placed it gently on the counter. I found her, I said softly into the silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from somewhere deep within the floorboards came a faint, peaceful sigh. The kind that sounds less like a ghost and more like someone finally at rest. The lantern flickered once, then burned steady. I knew what I had to do. I would meet Margaret, give her the letters and the journal, and tell her the story her parents never could. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about restoring the heartbeat of a love that had been buried beneath time. As I locked the shop for the night, the wind brushed past me, carrying the faintest scent of lavender, Eleanor's scent from the Hargrove estate. I smiled to myself. Somewhere I felt they were listening. Next, Part 5, The Journey to Savannah and the Final Letter. The next few nights in the old bookshop were heavy with unease. Daniel slept behind the counter, surrounded by the scent of paper and candle wax, trying to convince himself that everything had a logical reason. Yet, logic became fragile when the whispers began again, faint, almost tender, like a sigh brushing across his ear. He would sit up, heart pounding, scanning the darkness, listening to the sound of rain dripping through the gutters outside. But inside, within those walls, there was something else. It wasn't the creak of wood or the scurry of rats. It was softer, more deliberate. A voice, feminine, broken by tears, calling a name that didn't belong to this century. James, it would whisper, don't forget me. Daniel knew that name now, Jay from the letters. He pressed his hand against the wooden floor, feeling the chill beneath it, as if the heartbeat of another world pulsed below. He needed to know what was hidden there. One night, as thunder rolled across Charleston, he brought a lantern and a crowbar. The floorboards groaned under his steps as he searched for the hollow sound he remembered. When he found it, his pulse raced. He pried the board open, and cold air wafted up, a smell of dust, time, and something like perfume, faint but lingering. A trapdoor. Beneath it, a staircase descended into darkness. The air was stale, almost untouched by decades. He took the lantern, stepped down, and found himself in a small basement room. Stone walls lined with shelves, old crates, and a single wooden chair. Against the far wall sat a trunk. It was locked, but fragile with age. The lock gave way easily under pressure. Inside, beneath yellowed cloth and brittle papers, was a leather-bound journal. On the cover, embossed in faded gold, were the initials E.H., Eleanor Hargrove. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened it. The handwriting was elegant, looping, a voice from the past captured in ink. They won't let me see him, the first page read. Father says he is beneath us. Mother says I've shamed the family. I write here because it's the only place I can still speak. As he read further, the truth unfolded like a wound reopening after years of silence. Eleanor was imprisoned in her own home, forbidden to contact James, the soldier she loved. She was pregnant, her letters intercepted, her hope fading with each passing day. The journal chronicled her isolation, the locked doors, the whispers of servants, the slow erasure of her name from society. Her last entry chilled Daniel to his core. "They've taken my baby. They said it's for the best. I cannot bear this silence anymore. If love cannot cross these walls, then perhaps death will set it free." The ink trailed off as if her strength had vanished mid-sentence. Daniel closed the journal, his breath shaky. The lantern flickered, and then he heard it again. That same whisper, close now, right behind him. "James." He turned slowly, and there she was, faint. Translucent, a woman in a 1940s white dress, her face blurred by sorrow, eyes like moonlight through fog. Eleanor. She didn't move, didn't threaten. She only looked at him, her hand reaching toward the letters he still held. For a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. Then, as if compelled by something beyond himself, he whispered, "Eleanor?" The air trembled and her lips parted. "He never knew," she said, her voice trembling with both love and despair. "Tell him," I waited. Before he could speak again, the lantern went out. Total darkness. Silence. Then, a sound, not of footsteps, but of sobbing that faded like wind through the walls. Daniel stumbled upstairs, heart pounding, clutching the journal to his chest. When morning came, the shop was calm again, light-filled only with dust and sunlight. But something within him had changed. He knew now what the whispers meant. This wasn't just a haunting. It was unfinished love, trapped between time and regret, begging to be remembered. That day, Daniel didn't open the shop. Instead, he drove to the Charleston archives, searching records, tracing names. He found an old birth certificate. A baby girl born in 1944, other listed as E. Hargrove, father unknown. Adopted 6 months later. The name of the adopted family, Whitlock, his own. Daniel sat frozen as realization sank in. His grandfather was the adopted child. The bookshop, the inheritance, the letters, everything led back to this. He was part of the story. The echoes that called in the night weren't strangers, they were family. When he returned home that evening, the rain had stopped. The air was warm, the light golden. He placed Eleanor's journal on the counter beside the letters. "I know now," he whispered softly. "You're free." A soft wind moved through the shop, rustling the pages, and for the first time the silence felt peaceful. Yet he knew his journey wasn't over. There was one more person who deserved to know the truth. The woman who still carried Eleanor's bloodline, unaware of the history buried beneath the name Whitlock. Her name was Margaret. And so, as night fell again, Daniel packed the journal, the letters, and a heart full of unanswered questions. The whispers were quiet now, but they had guided him here. The road to truth and peace waited beyond the shop's door. The following morning dawned with a strange calmness, a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like release. Daniel awoke early, the pale light spilling across the wooden counter of Whitlock's books, catching the edge of Eleanor's journal. He had barely slept, haunted not by fear, but by a weight of compassion, the deep ache of someone else's sorrow echoing through his own blood. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, he noticed something unusual. One of the unmailed letters that had been stacked neatly the night before was lying open on the counter, its wax seal cracked clean through, as if by invisible hands. His heart raced as he unfolded it. The ink, though faded, still carried the softness of love written in desperation. "My dearest James," it began, "if you are reading this, then time has been kinder to you than it has been to me. They will not let me send this, but I write it anyway, for words are all I have left of you. They have taken our child, saying she will live a better life far from shame. They do not understand. Love is not shame, James. Love is light, even in the darkest war. If you never return, know this. You are my world, my freedom, my only truth. I will wait for you, even if waiting means forever." Daniel's eyes lingered on the final lines, "I will wait for you, even if waiting means forever." The air in the room seemed to grow thick with warmth, almost protective. He placed the letter down gently and whispered, "She waited." And then, almost like a sigh from the walls themselves, the faint scent of roses filled the air, the same floral note that had lingered in the basement. For the first time, Daniel felt no fear, just connection, a bridge between two eras, two hearts, one living and one lost. That afternoon, Daniel began searching for Margaret, Eleanor's daughter, the child torn away by the Hargroves and later adopted by the Whitlocks. It took weeks of phone calls, records, and old archives before he finally traced her. Margaret Whitlock Turner, age 78, living just outside Savannah. When Daniel called, she answered with a voice soft and uncertain, like a melody half forgotten. "Whitlock's books, you said?" she asked after he introduced himself. "My father used to tell me stories about that shop when I was a little girl. He said it was filled with ghosts of books and people who loved them." Daniel took a breath, steadying his words. "Mrs. Turner, I think I have something that belongs to you, to your mother." There was silence on the other end, long and fragile, then a single word: "Come." The next morning, he drove through the winding roads of South Carolina, the journal and letters wrapped carefully on the seat beside him. The landscape passed like a dream, moss-draped oaks, rivers of silver light, small towns still breathing echoes of the past. When he reached Margaret's home, she was waiting on the porch, silver-haired, graceful, her eyes soft yet sharp, as though they had seen too much and survived it all. Daniel greeted her with a gentle bow of respect and handed her the box. "I think these were meant for you," he said. She opened the box slowly, her hands trembling as she lifted one of the letters. Her eyes widened as she saw the handwriting. "This," she whispered. "This is my mother's hand. I've never seen it before, but I know." She read silently for a long time, tears slipping down her cheeks. When she reached the end, she pressed the paper to her heart. "They told me she died when I was born, but this means she lived, she loved." Daniel nodded, his voice quiet. "She was trapped. She wrote until she couldn't anymore, but she never stopped loving you." Margaret looked toward the horizon, where the afternoon sun spilled golden light across her garden. "And James?" she asked softly. Daniel told her about the soldier's fate, how Jay had died in the war, his letters unsent, his hope unreturned. She closed her eyes. "They both died waiting for each other," she said. "And yet here we are, their words, their blood, their memory, still alive." For hours they sat together, reading through the letters and journal entries, piecing together the love story that history had buried. By evening, the two decided to preserve it, to let the world hear what silence had hidden. They would publish the letters and journal as a book, The Letters from Nowhere, not as a tragedy, but as a tribute to enduring love. Margaret smiled faintly. "Maybe then she'll rest," she said. As Daniel prepared to leave, Margaret walked him to his car. The air was thick with the scent of magnolias and memory. "You've done what no one else could," she said, touching his hand. "You gave a mother back to her daughter and a lover back to her soldier." He shook his head gently. "No, ma'am. They found me. I only listened." That night, back at Whitlock's books, Daniel placed the last letter in a small glass frame and hung it near the counter. As he turned off the lights, he heard the faintest hum of wind, soft, melodic, peaceful. Not a whisper this time, but something lighter, freer, like a soul finally at ease. For the first time since the inheritance, the shop felt warm, alive in a new way. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the night, two lost hearts, Eleanor and James, finally found their way home. Weeks turned into months, and the letters from nowhere slowly began to take shape, not just as a manuscript, but as a living bridge between two centuries. Daniel worked with Margaret day and night, transcribing every letter, every fragile page of Eleanor's journal. Each sentence carried the echo of longing, of love that defied time and consequence. Sometimes, while reading aloud late at night, Daniel would swear he could still feel her presence, a soft warmth at his back, the faint sound of a sigh carried on the air, as though Eleanor herself listened to every word being reclaimed from silence. Margaret often said the same thing. "It's like she's watching us," she'd whisper, her old hands trembling slightly over the paper. "Like she's grateful." The process wasn't easy. Some of the letters were smudged with tears. Others had been written in shaky hands, as if Eleanor had struggled to hold the pen. Daniel preserved every imperfection. "We'll leave the ink stains," he said. "They're part of her voice." Margaret agreed. Together they decided that the preface would tell the truth, that these were the words of a forbidden love silenced by war and family pride, found generations later by the great-grandson who never knew he was part of it. It was a story too poetic to be invented. When the book was finally published, it spread faster than either of them could imagine. Local papers called it a haunting rediscovery of love lost to history. Readers across the country were captivated by the authenticity, the tenderness that felt too real to be fiction. Bookstores displayed it under true historical letters. Letters poured in from readers who had found old keepsakes of their own, faded photos, forgotten notes, unsent words. The letters from nowhere had awakened something universal, the desire to listen to what time had tried to bury. But something else changed, too. The haunting, the whispers, the scratching, the cold drafts through the shop, they all stopped. Whitlock's books became quieter, yes, but not empty. It felt cleansed, like a soul released after confession. The nights were peaceful now, only the soft ticking of the old clock remained. Daniel began sleeping through until morning, often waking to golden light spilling across the shelves. Sometimes, though, he'd find small signs, a single rose petal on the counter, the faint scent of perfume, a page left open in Eleanor's journal, as if someone had been reading through the night. On the day of the book's official launch in Charleston, Daniel, and Margaret stood together at the old bookstore, now restored and glowing under warm lamps. The crowd that gathered wasn't large, but it was filled with faces touched by the story. Daniel read aloud the opening letter. The first one James had written to Eleanor, the one that began it all. His voice was steady, reverent. If love survives the war, it will be because it has nowhere else to go but heaven. When he finished, the room was silent except for the sound of quiet weeping. Margaret stepped forward and said softly, "My mother wrote these letters in pain, but through Daniel, she found her peace. Through you all, she found her voice." The audience stood in a long, heartfelt silence before applause rose like a wave. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, Daniel sat alone in the shop. The lights were low, the air rich with the scent of paper and rain. He poured a small glass of wine and whispered, "It's done now, Eleanor. You're free." For a moment, he thought he heard a faint reply. Not words, just a sense of gratitude, like the quiet exhale of a soul finally at rest. A cool breeze passed through the aisles, rustling the pages of the letters from nowhere. One book fell open on the table, and when Daniel looked down, he smiled. It was the final letter, Eleanor's last, the one that had ended with the words, "If love survives beyond time, then I will wait for you in the quiet places, where only whispers remain." That night, Daniel locked the shop, turned the key, and stood outside beneath the lamplight. The rain had stopped. The street shimmered with reflections of gold and blue. For the first time, he didn't feel the pull of mystery or sadness. He felt gratitude to the woman who wrote her heart into paper, to the soldier who carried his hope across battlefields, and to the ghosts that had trusted him with their story. Margaret passed away peacefully 3 months later. In her will, she left Daniel a small wooden locket containing 2 black and white photographs, a young woman in a 1940s dress and a soldier smiling beside a tank. Inside, on the back, a single line was engraved, "Together, finally." Daniel placed the locket in a glass case at the bookstore beside the original letters. It became a small shrine, not for ghosts, but for love that refused to die. Visitors often stood before it in silence, some weeping softly, others just smiling, as if remembering someone of their own. In time, Whitlock's books became more than a shop. It became a sanctuary for lovers of words, seekers of stories, and believers in the unseen. People came not just to buy books, but to sit, listen, and feel the quiet peace that filled the air. Daniel would sometimes read from the letters from nowhere late into the night, his voice carrying through the stillness, merging with the rain outside. And always, somewhere within the hush, a soft whisper seemed to linger. Not haunting, but comforting. Like 2 voices finally reunited, speaking from somewhere beyond time. Years passed, and time, like a soft tide, carried life gently onward. Whitlock's books remained in Daniel's care, its wooden floors gleaming beneath the weight of 1,000 stories. The once forgotten shop had become a quiet landmark in Charleston, a haven for dreamers, writers, and lovers of lost tales. People traveled from across the country to stand where the letters were found, to feel the calmness that seemed to hum through the air, like a heartbeat too gentle to fade. Some came to find solace after heartbreak. Others came to whisper their own goodbyes to ghosts that lingered in memory. No one ever left untouched. The walls, lined with books older than memory, seemed to listen, always patient, always kind. Daniel had grown older, but peace had softened his face. His hair was now dusted with silver, his hands steady and warm. He still lived above the bookstore, in the same small apartment where he'd first heard the whispers. But those whispers were different now. They were not cries for help, not echoes of pain. They were like lullabies carried by the wind, faint reminders that love, once real, never truly leaves. Every night, as he closed the shop and turned the key, he felt their presence, Eleanor and James, not as specters, but as gentle guardians of the place that had restored their story to life. One evening, long after sunset, Daniel sat at his writing desk, candlelight flickering across yellowed pages. He had begun writing his own memoir, not for fame, but for truth. Its title, Echoes That Never Fade. He wanted to capture not only the story of Eleanor and James, but also the lesson their love had taught him, that silence can carry meaning, that time bends for the sake of love, and that listening is sometimes the bravest act of all. He paused to sip his tea, the scent of old paper and jasmine mingling in the air, and just as his pen hovered over the page, something made him look toward the far shelf, the one where the framed letter hung. For a brief moment, the candlelight shimmered oddly, as if reflected in unseen eyes. Then a soft voice, barely audible, drifted through the room. "Thank you." Daniel smiled gently. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The stillness of the room spoke enough. He dipped his pen once more and continued writing, his words flowing with quiet certainty. The story that began in dust and sorrow had become something luminous, proof that even in death, love can leave ripples that never cease. Outside, the rain began to fall again, tapping lightly against the windows, not mournful, but rhythmic, soothing. It was the same sound he had heard that first night when everything began. In the years that followed, the letters from nowhere found its way into libraries, schools, and even film adaptations. People called it a haunting masterpiece, unaware that every word had come from real hearts, not imagination. Tourists came to the bookshop in quiet reverence, some leaving letters of their own on the counter, sealed with wax, addressed to loved ones gone too soon. Daniel never opened them. He kept them in a carved wooden chest beneath the register, a continuation of Eleanor's box, a resting place for the world's unsent goodbyes. And sometimes when the night was long and the storm was heavy, he would swear he heard those letters whisper too. Dozens of voices blending into one tender hum of memory and love. One autumn evening, after closing the shop, Daniel sat by the window, watching the street lamps shimmer through rain. A young couple passing by stopped to take a photo beneath the store sign. The girl leaned into the boy's shoulder, laughing softly, her umbrella trembling in the wind. Daniel smiled, his heart warm. That simple sight, love alive in its quiet, ordinary way, was what Eleanor and James had been denied. Yet now, their story had gifted it to others. Through their pain, countless souls had learned to cherish what they still had, to write their own letters, and, most of all, to send them. When Daniel finally passed, peacefully in his sleep one winter night, the townsfolk gathered to honor him. They called him the Keeper of Whispers. In his will, he left Whitlock's books to the city's historical society, under one condition, that it remain open to the public as a house of memory. His final letter, found beside his journal, read simply, "Love endures beyond time if we listen to its echoes." To this day, visitors to Whitlock's books say that on quiet, rainy nights, they sometimes hear faint music in the air, an old tune from the 1940s played by no radio. Some claim to have felt a gentle brush on their shoulder like the touch of someone unseen. Others say they've heard the sound of pages turning when no one was there. But those who know the story, those who've read the letters from nowhere, understand. They smile softly, whisper thank you to the shadows, and step back into the world, hearts a little fuller. And so, the whispers never truly faded. They simply changed. From sorrow into song, from longing into peace. Because love, once real, doesn't die. It lingers, it hums, it writes itself into the air we breathe. And if you listen closely, late at night when the rain falls gently and the world grows still, you might just hear them too. Two voices entwined through time, murmuring from nowhere and everywhere at once, I'm here. Soft music fades in, rain on windows. If this story touched you tonight, take a deep breath and remember, every whisper, every echo carries a story waiting to be heard. If you believe love outlasts time itself, let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Whisper Sleep Studio for more midnight stories that speak softly to the soul. Until next time, sleep well, dream deep, and listen. The whispers never truly fade.